Okay, we're going to start. For those who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Till. I am head of Central St. Martin's, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. Thank you for all coming. I mean, this time of the year is, for anything like my diary, is quite crazy, so it's fantastic that you came out this evening. And it's a pleasure to introduce Ezio Manzini, who I guess all of you know. For those of you who don't know, he was trained as an architect, but is best known for his work over many years at the Politecnico of Milano, where he was looking at the intersection of design with sustainability before other people were, and then moved on into areas of design for social innovation. And has been very influential internationally in setting up networks, and the most recent of his networks, which he set up and coordinated and collaborates on, is called DESIS, which is Design for Sustainability and Social Innovation. Social innovation and sustainability, I should say. And that's a hub of laboratories, one of which is at UAL, run by Adam Thorpe out of CSM, but has a worldwide network. But the reason Ezio is with us, and I'm very pleased that he's now affiliating himself officially with us, is that this year Ezio was appointed as one of the 9 University of the Arts cross-university chairs. And we were delighted when Ezio took up our invitation to become chair of social innovation, design for social innovation. And Ezio immediately got to work and has come up with a project called Cultures of Resilience. Tonight he's not going to talk about the project, so I would talk very briefly about the project and then hand over to Ezio, who will then talk about the background to the project and some of the conceptual things which are emerging from the project. UAL is a funny, for those of you who are from outside, is a funny organization which is fiercely federal, but also fiercely sort of all together. And we negotiate these boundaries the whole time between being, we are Central St. Martin's, but no, we are the University of the Arts London. And we put out a call across the university for people who are interested in the broad area of resilience. And we're delighted that we got a number of people, and some of whom are in the room, who are working with us, or we're working collaboratively on this project, where we're going to be doing projects around the whole area of resilience, but taking it from various different angles, from activism to graphic design to artists to fashion designers, etc., etc. And so it's a sort of watch this space thing. We will be doing a set of public events, festivals, work in progress, seminars, etc., etc. So this is the first public engagement with Cultures of Resilience. And so on that, I will hand over to Ezio.
Thank you. Oh, I have this one, thank you. So, thanks, Jeremy, and welcome. I'm very happy to tell this story with you, to share it, because it's quite new. So I am not new, I have a long story. I'm very wise and have a very long story, but I have to change time by time because otherwise I get bored. So the new thing for me is this issue about resilience. And I've been so happy that the University of the Arts has accepted to take it as a topic on which to work. And I'm also very happy to collaborate with some people in this school. It is really a very interesting experience with me. As Jeremy said, we just started, and therefore I'm not presenting any result of the project. Even if you have already had some meeting, there is a beginning of a platform that is common to this group of people. But I have to say that what I'm saying today is not engaging the others. These are my ideas. Only the general title is shared with everybody. And the subtitle is my one. I don't know if everybody likes it or not. It could be an issue about discussion. And my 45 minutes of this presentation will have to have a relatively long journey because in some way, have to introduce the same notion of resilience, even if it is sufficiently well known, but it's also sufficiently messy, so the interpretations are very diverse. So we have to create also in an audience like this a minimum of common denominator, a common feeling on what we talk about when we say resilience. But just to tell you the story, that is also the story of the project, the notion of resilience is, let's say, a scientific notion that comes from the theory of the systems. And so by a certain point of view, to be resilient is something that could be similar if you are in London, or if you are in China, or if you are in South America. But the culture that are needed to promote resilience and the culture, the same, let's say, movement toward a more, hopefully, a more resilient system can generate are very local specific. So are related to the specificity, the specific cultural trajectory of the different regions in the world. So the discussion on the systems is a discussion that, of course, we have a little bit to know, but it's already sufficiently developed mainly on this technical side, where the discussion about the culture that could be related to resilience, in my view, is much more green. And so the beginning, it's difficult. We have to find the common language and so on and so forth. So I will start from resilience, and I will arrive to what I call the cultures of resilience that I've named here with this term. So everything has to be localized, so where we are, and we are here. And talking about resilience, I think that is both scientifically and philosophically important to shortly to go back to something that theoretically I'm sure that everybody of you knows, but is not so much in our mind. So we all live in a globe that if it was 1 meter wide, everything that is related to us is a skin of 1 millimeter. These are the proportions. So when we talk about the Earth and what is around, all our life from generation and generation is spent in a kind of very, very thin skin done by air, water, mineral, biological, organic matter. This is the world in which we are. And also this is very interesting because the story of this skin is in billions of years, where the story of a human being is only 200, only in relation to the other 200,000 years. And therefore, I've been very moved when I see, probably you've been to the Museum of Natural Science Museum here in London, and there is this clock that says, if all the story of the planet will be 1 hour, all the story of the human being, from the beginning, the human being as we consider now, is in 1/10 of the last second. Ping! And we are the ping. So we have to keep in account this, because when we talk about what we do in this planet, we have now the consciousness that was not the consciousness in the past, that we have the responsibility for something that is in some way a human, out from our human capability to imagine, because we can imagine some generation after us. Afterward, we cannot know what will happen, but we can imagine, but we cannot imagine hundreds of thousands of years. And our species, a human being, has the hope to last 2 million years, as it happened to many other species. So what happened in this very thin skin is what could compromise the possibility of our species to stay there. And this little skin has been quite turbulent. In a relatively short period, there has been a lot of very impressive mass extinctions. It could happen. But what we have to do is to avoid that. One reason for the mass extinction is ourselves and our incapability to face what will happen. So as I said, everything that we can talk, for the good or for the bad, is in this thin, turbulent skin in which our life takes place. And in my view, this is the most profound background of the idea of resilience. Because we can have the most different idea of what is the possibility of human being to control, and this will be what I will discuss in a while, but for sure nobody can control what will happen in such a long period. And therefore, the only wise strategy is the one to create conditions to be capable to not collapse when something happens, at least in a certain range, and to learn from the change in the environment to have the possibility in some way to upgrade our way of being. So there is nothing else that could be wise if not to in some way digest this idea of resilience. That is, of course, the capability of the system to respond to disturbance, resisting damage, and recovering. As I said, I think that this is, now there is a lot of people that talk about resilience because some local catastrophe happened, so we are thinking what happens after a catastrophe, but I think that there is a most deep motivation to talk about that. So this was the first point, where we are. But there is a second point that in some way crash against the first one. This is a very qualitative curve that represents what happened in the history of human being from, let's say, if you go back to the beginning of the Neolithic Revolution to today, it's more or less 10,000 years. So for 10,000 years, what the parameter that this curve could in some way evaluate, the number of people, the degree of consumption, and all what we can measure has been practically flat, practically for 10,000 years. And the Industrial Revolution, 300 years. So the beginning of this explosive curve is 300 years. 10,000 years, 300 years. We are in a system that is closed, so it's obvious. It's not obvious that our dynamism of human being will reduce. I hope that we will always be very dynamic, but the parameters that we have measured until now to describe our civilization, for sure, will have, if no catastrophe happens, to stabilize. The number of human beings, the dimension of consumption of energy, of materials, everything has to be stabilized. And we are there. So we are now in a phase in which the beginning of the recognition of the limit of the system are not anymore something that is written in the books of the Club of Rome. And you say, yes, maybe in the future it will be like this, but now we start to have the feedback that tell us that something has to happen. And so this is something that is perceived not only for who are studying these stories, but is perceived by everybody in the daily life. Maybe not everybody, but many people in the daily life. So this is a kind of a special condition because we are in a turbulent time, and somebody say, yes, but more or less every period of the history has been turbulent, but it's a turbulent time in which there is an orientation. So in some way, we are turbulent, but clashing against the limit. And so I think that inevitable, in a way that would be not evitable, there could be something like that. So this is the crisis. But the crisis normally is a short period. So we normally say, so the crisis will end. But in our foreseeable time of human being, given that it's an historical change of the more basic way of organizing our life, what could be a very short period in the history of the planet or even in the history of a human being is probably for sure my life, but also the life of the younger Win, and probably also of the son and the daughter of the people that is here. So it will last for generations, because it's a very profound change. So this very profound change is what we can call transition. And we can imagine that whatever can happen for a period, if we have to move from a society for which it was normal, the normal healthy way of being is to grow, toward a society that should find a way not to grow and to be healthy. So this is a change at every level, from the most technical to the most cultural and to the ethical one. So it's really the basis of our culture. Of course, the Western could be different from others, but in any case, at this moment, there is something that has been, for the good and for the bad, Westernized in our world. So we have to learn how to live in a condition of continuous experimentation. It has not always been like that. It will be like that. So for who is designer, I am designer, so I can talk better inside this kind of culture. Has not been said that we had to always experiment. There could be good professional people that did their work. They know what to do, and every project is a project. But now things are changing so fast that the normal professional designer, in my view, practically do not exist, but exist if you do something that is really important. You have always to invent, to find, and to experiment something new. So this is our condition. The third point of where we are is, therefore, we are in a kind of paradox. Because if we really want to become resilient, we have to change a lot, because our present system is very fragile. So to get resilience, that per se means to maintain something, we have to change the present state of things. And we have to do it in a resilient way. So the process that we use, as we will see in a while, cannot be a kind of center hierarchical decision that gives the direction where to go, but also the process of change has to be with the characteristics that we will see of the resilient systems. So we have to go a little bit more in depth in what is normally intended as resilience, and a very simple way to describe a little bit more is to say that there are different scales. And so we can talk, as I did until now. My first 10 minutes of presentation on resilience was the planet and the human being, so all that we can imagine. But there are very important studies that can be done at the regional scale, and a very important branch of the study on resilience are at the level of the planner, if you want. How we can plan a region with a society that are capable to be resilient. And this, we will see, bring to the issue about the distributed systems. But we can also discuss about place and community, that is how society is glued together and capable to resist to what happened, to all the problems, day by day problems that could be economical, physical, or whatever. So a discussion about how to reconstruct this relationship between a community and the place in which they live. And finally, there is the resilience of the personality of the people, the individual resilience. There is a very important stream of work on done by the psychologists, mainly, about the resilience of human beings. These are the people that study resilience could be so diverse, from the planner to the philosopher to the psychologist. But all of them can be described with a kind of common language. That is the language of the system, if you want. And so if we describe with the language of the system, we will see that they, at a different scale, they have something in common. And that this scale are simply because traditionally different disciplines work and that arrived to the issue by different angle. But when you really enter, you find that there is a relationship in between the resilience of a person, so the individual resilience, and the community. This is quite obvious. And the vice versa. A community is resilient, is the people inside the community have a resilient approach. And if you talk about the region becomes resilient if they are rich in the variety of community that exist in this. And the overall discussion about what will be the future of the planet has to keep in account as how people, community, and region will transform themselves to find again a sufficient level of resilience. So the resilience system, what they have. Now, I have to be very, very short, but there are at least 3 elements that are fundamental for the discussion that we want to do. They have a high level of diversity. Everybody knows that the ecologists talk about the importance of the biodiversity, and sometimes people say, yes, but why they are so interested in this biodiversity? The biodiversity is fundamental to create the resilience of the system. But also the cultural diversity. When we complain on the fact that culture, dialect, language are lost, it's not only a pity because it was a very nice group of people talking that language, it's that we are reducing the variety of the system in which we are. So at every level, or the technological level, if you have only, for instance, the crisis of transportation is not because the car per se, but because it has been thought that everything in transportation could be solved with the key. You jump in your car and you go from A to B, where the possibility to move has to be a kind of ecology of different possibilities. At the same way, who discuss and critique the market system, many of them, the one that for instance, I agree with, are not against the market system, but against the idea that the market system can solve everything. And there are also here in UK people that say something very interesting on the social economy intended as a kind of ecology or different economy. So all this is the possibility to reduce the diversity in the name of a certain idea of effectiveness, or consider the diversity, it's important. But also redundancy. Redundancy is a quasi-negative word, at least in the Western country, because if you are redundant, you are not really needed. So if you are not really needed, you have to disappear. Because what has to exist, only what is really precisely in the direction in which we want to go. Redundancy is fundamental for the resilience. If you want to go from A to B and there is only one road, this is fragile, because if in that road there is a problem, you cannot do anything. Redundancy means that you can go from A to B via many diverse trajectories. And this permits to do things following different trajectory. And finally, the resilience system have feedback. Feedback means something happens in the environment outside the system that we consider, and this creates a signal that arrives to some element inside the system that permits the system to change and to adapt to the new condition. And when we are talking about a system that include human being, feedback have a very simple name, is to learn. But really, to learn, it means that a good signal arrives to you on what is happening, and you have the possibility to change something because the signal is arrived and you're a human being, you start to behave coherently with the new information, and you learn from the experience, and the overall system in some way learn what to do. And unfortunately, very often, the systems are done in a way that try to not to make this feedback visible. So an example that I always do, if you have people in the car and you add air conditioning, radio, internet, and whatever inside the car, you say, but good, what is the problem? It's fantastic. It's fantastic by a certain point of view, but the system becomes more stupid. Because at that point, this becomes a kind of mobile office, and you have hundreds of thousands of people in the jam that feel as they were in the office. And so the possibility to perceive that there is something really wrong in being in a jam to get from A to B is reduced. So who had to be the censor? They say, hey, we have to do something because things cannot be like that. Is sleeping or listening to the radio, talking to the TV, but not reacting to what should be done to change something that appears so clearly, by a certain point of view, negative. So when we talk about systems that are resilient with human beings, the key word is learning for us. And here we move toward the issue about culture, because, of course, if a system that is not human, it's not mechanical, it's biological maybe, but in any case, the feedback is more or less given by the same system. The human being has several characteristics. One of those characteristics is that we are much more open and we learn from the experience. So for us, the feedback is not only something that works in a kind of machine that is already given, but we can add our experience to what already is there. And therefore, we use not only our sensors, but also our mind. In our mind, we have our culture, and so our culture is in some way the filter that perceives the signal, and also the one that can elaborate strategy for reaction. So the scientific field is clearly one that is very helpful to give this signal, etc., but if we don't talk about a more general culture, at the end of the day, also science is an aspect. The science that we know now is one, as a name, because it's been so important, but it's one of the many facets of the culture, and in particular of the Western culture, in the way that has been developed from a certain moment on. So we have to discuss about culture. And when we discuss about culture, immediately the question becomes very context related. So it depends who is talking about that. And personally, a small parenthesis, I'm very interested to do this work here, and this will be the place where I hope that we will have the same enthusiasm for 2 years. But it happened to me to travel in different places, so I try to develop the same kind of discussion in China or in South Africa or in other places that will happen to me to go, and to try to understand if and how the discussion is diverse. Because if we are here, and I cannot try to tell the story for somebody else. So I can, from this point on, tell my story. That is the story on which my culture is based, and on which, presumably, I have a little bit more of knowledge. And in my view, this painting of Raffaello represents very well the synthesis of what has been the high culture for us. So people, they mix together humanity, scientific research, debate, in a very open place, a kind of public space that you can see there, and they talk. And they have a kind of dialogue. So our culture has developed this idea of dialogue, and this is, as we will see, something very important. Of course, the definition of culture is very complex. I did it like this, not because it's an error, but simply because it's impossible to tell the whole story, so I want only to give the idea that it's a very long discussion, but I tried to capture 2 or 3 elements that could be useful for us. Culture is about meaning. So it's about the way in which a group of people, thanks to the language, generate meanings. And of course, when we talk about a change, for instance, from what was a certain search for our system to a resilient system, we have to redefine the meanings. For instance, in this moment, resilience is connotated mainly as a defensive negative issue. And what I'm trying to do and to propose is to change it and say, okay, it happened because we had some risk, but at the end of the day, maybe it's a very good idea. And it depends on the way we change when the context changes, so how the feedbacks work. And finally, of course, if it is this, is the way in which we learn. So the way in which we have been socially given our culture define the way in which we can learn from the experience. So in the European tradition, there is something that could require a lot, but I think that this picture captures very well one element or some element that I want to talk. I think that you know this picture, it's Leonardo da Vinci. It's the same period, a little bit earlier than the other ones. And it tells the story that the human in the Renaissance in Europe has been collocated at the center of the universe. So the belly of this person is the center of the universe as it is represented. And secondly, and this is important, it has not always been like this for all the culture. And secondly, that when we see the reality, we see a kind of messy, chaotic situation, but if you look very carefully, there are proportions, and you can find an order beyond the chaos. So in our culture, in the mainstream of the culture, the chaos is apparent. But if you really study, you can get the simplicity, the simple model on which everything is done. Nobody really, I think, thought to arrive to the end of the discussion and know everything, but it was mentally thought that if you really study a lot through the science, through the discussion, you can get a way to represent things in a simple, clear, transparent, crystal way. It has been very powerful, and I am convinced that for the good and for the bad, a lot of bad, the success of the Western civilization is largely based on these ideas that gave a certain kind of energetic hint in going on. Now, I am sure that you know where I want to arrive. The issue is, are these ideas coherent, good, to face what we have to face? So the world is going toward the necessity to be resilient. And this is the discussion. So before, or better, I tell my ideas through some ideas that emerge, so selecting some ideas that emerge. And what we see, that there is a growing perception that there is no control on the future. We have had line of thinking, philosophical, that had the idea that the story had the line, that there was a way where we had to go historically, that was possible to foresee what will be in 5-year time, all the 5-year plans that has been done by the Soviet. Now we know that the future is unforeseeable. And this is a big change in our perception. The second one is that the human being make errors. So the engineers can say, oh, but now I do a power plant that will be fantastic. It studies so well, it will never break. But they break. It happens. Because even if there is 0.0000001 possibility, that possibility can happen. So you cannot imagine that nothing that we do and nothing that happens in our world is perfect. Error is part of our life, and we have to accept it. And I already said that diversity is not only, oh, we are maybe designer or artists, we like to make things different because we are strange. Diversity is fundamental to have a resilient system. So we have found a strong motivation, a very strong motivation for the need to maintain and increase diversity. And as I said before, redundancy is not a bad word. You are redundant out, but it's a good word for the reason that I said before. These ideas, in my view, for the Western culture to which I refer, are disruptive. I don't know if they are so disruptive. I don't know if you are Chinese. For the Chinese, I don't know where you come. So for other culture, could be very diverse. This is our story, our Western story, to face resilient in this way. If you are in a village in Africa, you have the Ubuntu, the move from Ubuntu to resilience probably is very diverse. If you have the yin and the yang, probably from yin and yang toward resilience is another trajectory. And this will be very interesting to recognize and to maintain, of course, also in the, to give more concreteness to what I said. Now, it will be a little bit stereotype, but I think that it's the mainstream idea when it's in some way under a kind of technical mainstream point of view. There is the idea of the control. You do whatever you can to control, and the important is to organize a system that permits to control everything. There is the issue of optimization. Given that I can have all the information, I can, on the basis of this information, I'm a rational person, and so I can find the optimum. For the engineer, has always been like that, searching for the optimum. And it has to, the optimum is evaluated on the basis of how much it is effective. So effectiveness becomes the major word. Everything should be in the direction of making things more effective. And changing a little bit the structure of the issue. If you have a big problem, you need to have a big project. What the Soviet Union did, they had so much power, centralized, that they said, we want to have a new Soviet Union that is very strong, so we have this planning, 5-year planning, 10-year planning, all this kind of story. And they have been a totally failure, we know. But the idea was, if the problem is big, the project has to be big also. Now, as you imagine, there are some emerging ideas, and maybe some of them you will see are already familiar because we are already in the transition from one system of idea to the other. So they are not, I'm not going to tell you something that say, oh my God, this I never heard. There's something that are in between us, but the other one are still the dominant. So instead of controlling everything, the first quality of a system is to be error-friendly. It means we know that there could be a mistake. We know that something can happen. The very important thing is that more or less it works, and at the same time, if something goes wrong, it do not create a catastrophe. So this is one of the basic technological engineering position toward. It's not so strange. There is a don't put all your egg in one bag. So don't put all your egg in your basket. So it was this kind of idea because it's risky. So putting many different ones. The president, the vice president of the United States never goes in the same plane. So we are not inventing something that is totally new, but here it has to become the main way of looking to things. So the notion about error-friendliness, in my view, is very important. You cannot search for the optimum because you cannot know what will be the optimum, because you can only have a little vision about the variety, the informations. So you have to accept some result that could be acceptable for the group of people that is there in that moment. So not the optimal, but the acceptable. And more than effective, it has to be adaptable. So be capable to change if something changes. And finally, if there is a very big problem to face, you have to make, paradoxically, many small little projects. Maybe with a vision, but are the small little projects that are capable to face step by step the different elements and not have the risk of the big project that you start today. A big project should be ready in 5 years, and when you arrive 5 years later, everything is changed. So you have to create a way of thinking the big transformation in a resilient way. That means making experimentation, moving things, and see what's happening, and being flexible enough to change in relation to what the system is telling you. All this together create a kind of scenario that I tell with my words, but it's quite diffuse, even if it's not the dominant one. Then we can call the scenario distributed system. So we have a very particular example of the internet against the vertical mainframe of 50 years ago. And so the possibility to create network because they are more resilient. Internet is internet because it's been designed to be resilient. So this is why it's so successful. This is why it's so difficult to cut it. Even if I will not say that internet is and its structure is a solution on everything, because there are several concentration of power that happen. But this is a very long discussion. So when you start to talk about distributed system and the economy and the way of working of the network, there are a different way of considering how you can avoid something that is happening in our internet that create a basis for many people to be very active, but create also some very high-level, powerful elements that are out of any possibility of control. So the idea, in technical term, is to move towards something that is networked, so infrastructure as a network, as the internet, as the distributed power generation with the smart grids, as the redefinition of how the production could be done, having distributed production. So there are different technological innovations that happened in the last decades and that are happening now. For instance, the move toward the distributed manufacturing is relatively new, where, of course, the distributed computing is 30 years old and has been also successful. So the issue about distributed system is the part that I said at the beginning, relatively clear. Everything has to be done, but there is a discussion, there are technicians, there are people that are talking, that are trying to solve problems and to improve. Here we are to discuss the beginning. I'm going to finish, don't worry. The culture that could be related to this scenario. And if there are some emerging cultures, and if the story, now going back in my being a European, is this story everything has to be thrown away because it's not coherent with the resilient? In my view, no. There is something that we can keep and that maybe could be our Western special contribution to the discussion about resilience. To make clear what I want to say, I will use this other very famous painting. This has been done 1 century before the other. The other was in the full of Renaissance. This is when the Renaissance was starting to happen, so it's a painting that is still in the age of the cities that was autonomous state and have the very peculiar way to be hub, but they was also relatively open and relatively, this is Siena, relatively international. And if we look to this painting, that is done by Lorenzetti, is in Siena, in Palazzo della Ragione, we can see a lot of very interesting things that resonate to something that we are saying today. So the territory that we see is a very multifunctional territory. You have farmer, craftsman, a different kind of farming, different kind of crops. There is a very interesting symbiosis in between the city and the farmland, a little bit as a 0 mile food that we are talking about, or the community supported agriculture that we are talking about now, or the farms or gardening in the city. If you move inside the city, you see that there are a lot of different functions also there that happen from who are making something, who are playing. There are open space, the public spaces are very important. So you see also in this case multiplicity and variety. And the public space are very important. So everything happens in something that is public. And people meet and people discuss. And here we arrive where I think that the Western culture can bring something. Because I already anticipate there is something in this vision of the 14th century in Europe, in Tuscany, Siena, that is error-friendly, acceptable, adaptable, mesh of networks, very interesting. And it was like this, because I've not said, maybe somebody of you do not know, that this is a very huge painting on the wall that is called Allegoria del buon governo, del buon e del cattivo governo. They mean allegory of the good government, good and bad government. And the bad government is the tyranny. You see a very dark condition of the people and a tyrannic power, where the good government is based on dialogue. And I think that this is very important. So we, Western, I do want not to judge other culture, but for sure we are accustomed to a very critical way of being. It's our problem, but it's also our strength. And be critical if you want to have a resilient system is fundamental, because the critics is what permit to listen and to cultivate different ideas, to have also ideas that could be in contradiction, and being in contradiction, they can generate some attention that could be very interesting. And from long time ago, we had something that can be called democratic rules. Not always, unfortunately. We had created monsters also in Europe, but there is a story of a regime that is based on the dialogue. That is not so obvious, that is not for all the culture in the same way. So I think that the notion of resilience, when we move toward the cultural side, and especially on the most basic quasi-political side, has a lot to do with the critical, for us at least, with the critical thinking, and with what we can call a democratic approach, or some democratic rule, that is not necessarily the party, the way in which you vote, but it's the basis of democracy, that is, I create a system in which different ideas have the right to coexist, even if they are opposite. And if you are in China, when they talk about harmony, it could be fantastic, but also not, because harmony tries to put together everything in the same body. That is a kind of more than, for us, the metaphor would be a kind of biosystem, ecosystem with many different entities that could be collaborating, but they could be also competing, where another model could be the one of the one organism, as in the Chinese medicine. So it's one organism, everything is together in a holistic way. I'm not criticizing. I've said how much we have to change. I only try, maybe in a little bit superficial way, to start to reflect how different is to say, if I say these are very fundamental for us, that we have not to change so much. They are already in our cultural DNA. Maybe for others, there are other things that are more near to their own cultural DNA, but maybe they have to move more in this direction. I already say. So in my view, this idea of tolerant governance, so every discussion about resilience is about a certain looseness, the possibility to adapt. Things has not to be too precise. So this notion about tolerance and a government that is a government that has to be tolerant to the diversity can be synthesized in this promote and cultivate the critical thinking and promote and cultivate better rule of democracy. What is the difference in between this landscape of 7th century ago and today, practically? Is that the community that we had there and the place that we have there was quasi-natural. They were there. Nobody had the problem to say, we have to make a community or we have to build a place. The places existed because they were produced by the history. And the same for the community, and they were produced in a long time. The difference is that if we want to recreate something similar to this one, there is something I would like to recreate. It has to be totally designed. Not designed by one person outside, designed by the people that are there. If you want to have a community, you have to decide that you want to be part of a community, because it's not given. And the mainstream tended to create hyper-individualistic profile. So the new community that we see around us are in some way designed in the sense that I said, not that somebody can design totally a community, but you can create conditions, make some choice. And in my view, the same is for the place. So the tradition, the place existed, and people was in a place as a fish in the water. Now the tendency has been to, and there have been also books talking about the end of the sense of place. But now, I'm sure many people in between you are studying how to recreate something that, what is a place? It's a space with meaning. So you have to do something to recreate the meaning. And this has to be intentional. So the change is that there could be something of the new culture, a new way to organize the society that could look like this beautiful picture of 7 centuries ago, but in the reality, it's totally diverse, because the dynamism thanks to which it happened is totally diverse. And the diversity is that if something happens, it's because people decide to make it happen. So communities and places, if and when they exist, are created by choice. I am a moderate optimist, so I try always as a designer to see the full part of the glass. And so there are good news. Even if this one maybe appeared to be much more good news 1 year ago, 2 years ago, now we have seen also some negative feedback. But nevertheless, I think that there is something that on the long run is happening, a kind of new idea of democracy that is emerging everywhere in the world. And there are millions of people that are living part of their life in a way that is not the mainstream. So what we call the social innovation, the bottom-up social innovation. They organize the food, the mobility, the residential issue in a different way. And also, as I said before, in the last few years has exploded this idea of the makers of the Fab Lab and the possibility to challenge the monologic that was, if you want to produce something, it has to be big. Now we discover that it's possible to have a very advanced way to produce something at the corner of the street. And this is changing, even if it is not, is far from being the mainstream, it's introducing some ideas. And these ideas are very diffuse. Now I don't tell you the story of the different cases, it's only to give, I'm sure that you know, the flavor that what we are talking about, it's really very diffuse, even if the cultural meaning could be very diverse. So this is a community-supported agriculture in China. And of course, if you have the term community, the term agriculture, and the term relationship, in China are totally diverse than here. Nevertheless, there is the idea of people in the city that decide to do something to support the farmer and have him back at a reasonable price what they need in terms of organic food, could be spread everywhere, even if the cultural motivation could be so diverse. So this is the flavor of hundreds of ideas that in the last, the time is passing, 20 years, appeared, and some of them also spread in the planet. Normally, people like me and many friends talk of them mainly by the social point of view. My network is called Design for Social Innovation. But clearly it's social, but it's social with a very strong political, also political, but also cultural dimension. So here I like to talk about the cultural dimension, so what they are doing. Now, you can imagine, and maybe I will do another time, lecture specifically on that. This is more normal for me. But you could look to these cases of social innovation, bottom-up social innovation, by the point of view of how they challenge the normal, for us, mainstream culture, and you can see that they build a community and that are open, as in this image. You have people that are very diverse, so it's not the typical new community, the digital community that tend to be very homogeneous. So here the idea is to open and to have community done by many different people. They tend to be rooted in the place, and also here the new digital system could be also interesting, but sometimes they are totally independent for the place. This one has some rules in the place. They could have different functions. If you have co-housing, the people do together 360 degrees or different activities. Sometimes they last in time. It's not only a flash mob to have people together for 2 hours and have everybody disappear. Not that the flash mob is bad, but I mean, they are not really contributing so much in creating new social fabric. They are done in a way that people learn during the doing. And I think that if we have to look for this new culture that is emerging, we are not to invent it. We can also invent. We are free to invent something, but there is a lot that is already happening around. And it could be very good to look at it. And this kind of culture is a framework that I call Cosmopolitan Localism. That means exactly the fact that you have many small things that have their own culture, but at the same time they are part of a larger system. And here it's really difficult because I don't know what you think, but the community can also close themselves. We have an awful, by my personal point of view, example of community that close themselves and they become a danger, even for themselves. So the balance, but at the same time, if you open too much, you lose the sense of being together, and you don't have anymore the social fabric, the social cohesion. So the difficulties is to find this balance in between being sufficiently close to create a sense of community, at the same time sufficiently open not to end up in being a group against the others. To put in practice this at the scale of the planet is what could be this, I call it here, I think, a meta-culture. So it's not a specific culture. It could be a kind of cultural platform in which many different and hopefully very diverse culture could flourish. Of course, going back and concluding, to develop this new idea of place and community that have to be closed and open at the same time in a good balance in between the two. It means to design something that could be synthesized in design for what is the process of community building. And there is a lot of things that designer can do for the community building. And something that is related to placemaking. And is it true what I said before? The places are not a given, but they have to be in some way generate. And obviously there is a relationship in between the placemaking and the community building. And this is what design should do. And there is a fantastic quote of Wolfgang Sachs that is the one that for the first time I heard using the term that I'm using here. And this is your school. That, by the way, yes. No, that, by the way, in my view, at this scale, is one of those places that has been invented and create a kind of soft community. At least when sunshine, I think this is a typical condition in which I have, coming from outside, and every time that I hear and I look what happened, I find that it's really something that say, look, you cannot design a community, but you can create a condition that permit to people to be that kind of soft and nice community. Thank you. Boss, what happened now?
Any questions?
I think I'd like to just make one observation that hit me. Thank you. I think
Tell who you are so people can know you.
Josephine Green, I am. I'm involved in the social innovation movement, etc., etc. I think, though, for me, what's interesting in all this is, you know, Piketty, the book Piketty is the man of the moment. I think this gives so much, it rebalances and gives a lot of emphasis to human capital. So in this whole issue around, you know, wealth capital and what we've suffered under wealth capitalism, I think the most important thing here is that it reinterprets what human capital means, not in a kind of technocratic sense, but it gives a lot of substance to returning to the fact that it is about people, and it is about people's energy, and it is about human capital rather than wealth capital. And I think that's a very important issue in around the whole area of our attempt to change things.
You do the job?
I'll take one at the back and there.
You talked quite a lot about this sort of anarchic, cosmopolitan, free, organic development of culture. The example of King's Cross, I think, is quite an interesting one, because I think this works really well in that freedom of movement, but it is, I think, high on the list of those sorts of places that are critiqued by the movement, saying that public space is increasingly becoming private space, and in that sense, it's actually quite a managed space, and that organic movement and flow is quite it's confined. What do you say to that?
Hello, Christian Langheim. As a designer and a mother, and a single mother, so sometimes I have to make some difficult choices. I think a big issue is responsibility. How can we foster responsibility in many people? You know, you think of China, some of their systems work quite well for a lot of people who don't want to take responsibility to be part of changing the resilience of the globe. But then there are very few people who are working very hard, but you know, how can you measure their success? How do you foster that? Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for if you have a government that says, right, this is what has to be done, but then I'm all for individual choice, but sometimes some of the choices you have to make it difficult. So it's, how do you foster responsibility?
I like the idea that the space can be a resilient space where local community can take it back and engage. But there's part of me, and I can see that happen from when I first started here to in this building to now. You can see that more kids are coming, that it's not completely controlled. But I do suspect the fountains were put there to stop people marching or meeting. So that, you know, I wonder how, you know, in terms of a security dynamic, if you wanted to stop large groups, you know, meeting here to march, then you put the fountains up, right? Yeah. And so I've always had this deep suspicion, sorry, but it may be that my mind is dark. It might be that my mind is dark, but that was just the point. You know, sorry.
Go over there, and then the last one here.
Thanks for that, Ezio. Obviously, the conversation around cultural resilience has been going on for a little while here at UAL. And thinking it through, one of the things that I couldn't quite get my head around previously, that this is starting to make obvious to me, maybe I'm a bit slow, is what seems to be a contradiction between what's sort of good for a resilient system, and so it relates to your issue around scale. The contradiction between the resilient system and the notion of redundancy within the resilient system, and what that means for the elements within that system, or in this instance, the people. So for a system to be resilient, like the market to be resilient, actually it's good to have some redundancy there, supply and demand thinking and so on. But that's bad for the elements of that system, i.e. the people. So, but what you've been speaking about today makes it explicit to me anyway that there needs to be some shift, explicit shift in values from this sort of market orientation towards a more human-centered orientation to enable that redundancy to make sense. So in a way, for the system to be resilient, we need to invest in redundancy, to enable, but it needs to be an investment, it seems, in a sort of an active redundancy rather than a passive redundancy. So it's a redundancy where it might not be essential that this thing's happening now to optimize or effectiveness or whatever it is, but it is essential that something's happening, that it's not just sort of sitting there doing nothing, otherwise we don't have that diversity of choice almost should situations change. So thanks for that, and that sort of resolves something for me in terms of those differences at scale. And is that your perception of it?
On the observation of Lorena, maybe you're right, but I think that we have to try to see the positive energy and use the positive energy to make further step. Because otherwise we are paralyzed by the complexity, because everything, if you want, is on the first line that I said, that nobody can really foresee all the implication of what you do. So you have to focus on something that is valuable and try to give value and to use it as a way to tell story that can involve other people in the same idea. If at the beginning of the story, maybe they had another motivation, for me, it's not so important at this stage. If they had the motivation. But I don't pretend to convince you, it's simply my position. And yes, what your observation, I agree. I think, I don't know all the professors that are in the school and the student, of course, but practically all the ones that have the opportunity to talk are working on some local issues, some communities, something that is at the scale that, if you look all together, create redundancy in the positive sense of the term. So in my view, here there is a good example, not only here, also in my university, in many places. There are a lot of bit of work that are already in this direction, and maybe the very modest attempt with this project is to give a more visible framework that permit to keep such a different experience together and have more capability to present themselves to be more strong in some way.
One last question then. I saw one, who was it? No, it wasn't you, it was you. Otherwise we'd be here all evening.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, it wasn't really a question. Was just I have an example. I'm like, for my master project, I'm doing some furniture, and my aim is to study the reaction from the public in different public private spaces, and I placed some furniture just in front of Central St. Martin's, and has been removed after 20 minutes from the guard. After 20 minutes, I was shooting and I've been completely removed. And this is, I think, a good example of how the boundaries between public and private are subtle in what we think private space, public space are. And I don't know, like, I'm Italian as well, and I think we have a kind of different way of living the public spaces compared to here and what I'm going to study now. I just thought this one was a good example. Yeah. Because it's not a public space. I just placed
Okay, I think we could go on, and if people want to, we might go down the bar and go on, but otherwise, to thank Ezio very much for this evening.